Okay, so I just want to welcome everyone to the first talk in the Transforming Social Work speaker series. And this series stems from numerous calls to action within our profession and broader society. We understand that recognition of social work's colonial roots requires reflection on our past and present to determine how, as a profession, we can move towards a liberatory transformation. So my name is Amanda Tatro. I'm a PhD student, and along with Professor Alicia Boatswain-Kite, we have organized this series for you with the support of the School of Social Work at McGill. We are very excited to have Kai Cheng Thom with us today to present her talk, The Work We Came to Do, Transformative Justice and Reclaiming Professional Ethics. So Kai will speak to us until around 3:30, and then we'll follow that with a half-hour question-answer period that Alicia Boatswain-Kite will moderate. I have to say that this talk would not have been possible without the efforts of Professor Catherine Maurer. So thank you very much for your help, Kate. Thank you. So before I introduce Kai, we'd like to acknowledge that McGill University is located on unceded Indigenous lands. The Kanien'kehá:ka, the Mohawk Nation within the Haudenosaunee Nation, are recognized as the custodians of the lands and waters on which we gather. Tiohtià:ke, Montreal, is historically known as a gathering place for many First Nations, and it continues to be home to diverse Indigenous peoples. This is the first time I do a public land acknowledgement, and as a white non-Indigenous person whose family on my father's side arrived as settlers over 200 years ago from France, it's really important for me to claim responsibility and complicity as a historical subject in the structural violence and oppression that still exists for Indigenous people due to colonialism. It's equally important for us all to commit to honoring and contributing to efforts to redress historic and current acts of structural violence against Indigenous peoples and against the lands on which we live. So with that, we would like to welcome Kai Cheng Thom. Kai Cheng Thom is a trans woman of color who completed her MSW and MSc in the couple and family therapy program at the McGill School of Social Work. After 4 years of practice as a public sector mental health clinician, working with trans youth and families in downtown Toronto, she shifted into work as a consultant, coach, and mediator who supports helping professionals and organizations navigate pressing conflicts, questions of conflict, and social justice. She is also the innovator of the Loving Justice Framework, a trauma-informed model of conflict resolution rooted in transformative justice and prison abolition. Kai is also the author of 4 award-winning books across multiple genres. So welcome, Kai, and I will turn it over to you.
Thank you so much, Amanda. Thank you to Alicia and to Kate as well for the part you played in bringing me here to speak with you all, bringing me back here to speak with you all at the McGill School of Social Work. For those of you who don't know me, I not only did 2 master's degrees, but also my bachelor's degree in social work here. So I spent a lot of time at the McGill School of Social Work. I have many fond memories, and also a few memories that I'm not fond of. But that's true of everyone's school experience. I'm so delighted to see many familiar faces, and also quite a few new faces and names too. What a delight. I'm speaking to you today from Toronto, also known as Toronto, land originally governed by the Dish with One Spoon Wampum Treaty. The Dish with One Spoon indicates how the land is meant to be shared, its resources are meant to be shared, in collaboration and in harmony. And while I think that's probably not been honored, as we can see looking at the colonial legacy of the current government, I think it's still really important for us to reflect upon how we, in our various lineages and the stories that we come from, can look toward honoring the Dish with One Spoon Wampum Treaty in the future, even if we're not living on Dish with One Spoon Wampum land. The original stewards of Toronto are the Haudenosaunee, the Anishinaabe, the Huron-Wendat, and the Mississaugas of the Credit. So it is with great respect and humility that I come to you today from this place, beaming to you, over to you in Tiohtià:ke, and just really excited and delighted to share some of my work with all of you. I'm about to pull up a PowerPoint. I know we're probably all terrified. Maybe we're terrified, probably also all exhausted of PowerPoint Zoom. So I'll try my best to make this interactive and exciting. What could be more interactive and exciting than an ethics presentation? So this is the work we came to do. We're rethinking professional ethics. I'd like to start by reading you a little poem about justice, because I'm a storyteller at heart. I was a storyteller long before I even knew what the term social work meant. And so I'll bring you a little bit of storytelling now. This poem is called I Want to Know What Bruce Wayne Dreams About. And for those of you who are uninitiated into the comic book world, Bruce Wayne is the secret identity of Batman. I want to know what Bruce Wayne dreams about. If he's Bruce during the day and Batman at night, does he even ever sleep? All the superhero beating up bad guys, being the biggest, baddest cop in the world stuff got old a little while ago. And in the era of contemporary social justice politics, we know that Bruce really ought to just give up vigilantism and donate his billions to the masses, thus reducing poverty, thus reducing crime, thereby achieving his mission in vastly greater measure than he could ever hope to accomplish by beating up the Joker 100,000 times. But you know, Bruce is a literal detective genius, and I'm pretty sure he's figured this out. I don't think he wants to end crime or even violence. There's another thing in there that he's after. And here's where my curiosity comes in, because I think I get it. I think I know what Bruce Wayne dreams about. On the bat plane, between adventures, in that gray space between dark and dawn, I think he dreams about the sound of his mother's pearls hitting the pavement, the crack of the gunshot, the warmth of blood, the smell of the air the night they died. I think he dreams about being ready for the next time, in the next dream, where he'll be bigger, stronger, better prepared. Every real life villain a practice run for the next time he's in the alley and the mugger pulls the gun. I want to be Batman's psychotherapist. I want him in the analysis chair. I want to tell him, Bruce, honey, can't you see? Nothing you do is ever going to bring them back to life. And then he'll say, but I crave justice. And I'll say, justice doesn't change the past. And he'll say, the villains need to be punished. And I'll say, punishing them won't make you safer. And he'll say, so what do you want me to do? And I'll say, I'm asking you to be brave. I'm asking you to forgive yourself. So that's my little Batman poem. I have always loved superheroes for many reasons, but particularly because the origin story of most superheroes is a trauma story. I don't know if you've noticed, but it tends to be. Superheroes are all tied up in this question about trauma and justice, and how do we work through our trauma toward justice. And what's really fascinating about superheroes is that they kind of ride this line between the punitive cop and then something else, right? There's something else like super powered, full of potential, a person who could really change the world. Most superheroes don't actually change the world because they have to preserve the status quo so that they can sell more comic books and make more movies. But, you know, the germ of the idea is there. A superhero is someone who reimagines justice. And I will tell you this, I never really wanted to be a social worker when I was a kid. Like I didn't go to kindergarten and be like, oh my gosh, I want to be a social worker. I wanted to be a superhero. I wanted to be a superhero. I wanted to change the world. mostly for me at first, but also for others. And what I really resonate with the Batman superhero story now as an adult is I think he has to know that there's something that's not working about his vision of justice. He's remade justice in his own vision. He's a vigilante, but something's still not working. And the thing about Batman is that he doesn't have a lot of power as Batman. He has a lot of power as Bruce Wayne, who is a billionaire, um, who could really do a lot of change in the world outside of being a superhero if he chose to be. And so this is my invitation for you all to think about. What kind of superhero are you trying to be? What kind of social worker or social service helping professional are you trying to be? And what is the world you hope to bring into being? Okay, this is my bio. You've heard lots about me. I will say maybe an update for those who knew me a few years ago at the McGill School of Social Work, and a grounding for those who are just getting to know me. I currently work as a professional conflict resolution practitioner. So that's a mediator, someone who gets involved in other people's conflicts and tries to facilitate coming to a resolution. Outside of classic mediation, I also do circle work and systems work. And all of that draws upon the stuff I learned at the School of Social Work, also other social work and social service physicians, particularly systems theory and systems thinking, and my background as a social justice activist. And that's sort of a weird thing to call myself. I don't know that I feel like I have the right to call myself an activist. It feels like a big mantle to take on. But certainly I've been involved in social justice activism and in queer and trans communities of activism since I was a teen. And so all of those threads are things I try to pull together in the world of mediation and conflict resolution because I think it is sorely needed right now. What brought me to conflict resolution, and particularly conflict resolution in the workplace, particularly in social service agencies and nonprofits and social enterprises, is that I have been in those kinds of spaces for, oh gosh, like 2 decades now, and I'm 30. So since I was around 10, I've been in community organizations as a participant, as a client, as a worker, a volunteer in some kind of way. And there's something really beautiful and exciting about community organizations, about the vision that they bring. There's something really exciting and delightful about the potential for bringing about a world of social justice, where people are treated justly with dignity and the respect they deserve. And as beautiful as that dream is, I don't know if you've noticed this, but something always tends to go a little sour, like somewhere, some ways into a community agency, into a social enterprise, maybe a little way into your experience of social work school. Not that these things are all bad, but we discover that not all is well in so-called paradise, right? There's at some point there's a conflict. And for me, these conflicts were huge and devastating. People would argue about the right way to do social justice. In social work school, there were huge divisive arguments while I was there, if I can say that, debates in classes, outside of classes, between students, perhaps between faculty, about what was the right way to pursue the world that we were envisioning, what was the right world to envision. And these conflicts could be so terribly traumatic that they really impacted people's understanding of who they were and what they were doing and the people around them. Sometimes I watch people leave social work school, I've watched people leave social work organizations, I've watched people leave community orgs and agencies, leaving their dreams behind, all this kind of stuff. And it broke my heart because part of what I was looking for when I was going into social service was I was about to say replacement family. It's probably true to some extent. It's looking for community. Unfortunately, when we bring our woundedness and our deep hoping into community, we also bring a really high possibility for disappointment. And then we also live in a system that is loaded with oppressive forces and oppressive philosophies, oppressive practices that make it really easy for us to disappoint each other. So that's my conflict story. I decided that I wanted to get into it because, like Batman, I wanted to be ready for the next time. I really wanted to get good at dealing with conflict. I wanted to be an expert at dealing with conflict so I could make my life conflict-free, which I don't know about you, but that hasn't worked out for me yet. I'll let you know if I ever figured it out, but I did get the mediation certificate, so I became a mediator. Oh, that's not what I wanted to do. There we go. So let's see, is that the right slide? Yes, it is. Okay, so today I'm going to do a few things. I'm going to explore with you the political context of professional ethics in health and human services with an eye toward personal and interpersonal ethical conflicts that we face as helping professionals of various social locations and identities. We're going to look at how we can navigate political and ethical conflicts in a generative, trauma-informed way. And we're going to think about how we can bring a new paradigm into being where our professional ethics and transformative justice practice are aligned. All of that in an hour and 20 minutes, and also enlightenment. So I really think you're getting a good deal for what you're paying me to be here. Be ready for your life to be changed. I will say this is like a very brief glimpse of like some of the concepts that I'm pulling together in my work and that I'm getting really excited about, just the briefest taste. And if you'd like more, hit me up on my website, bring me in, and we'll have a longer talk. This is just a little sense of what I'm doing, and maybe it'll jive with some of what you're doing as well. So, experiential component. Every 20 minutes in a Zoom presentation have an experiential component. Someone told me that it stuck in my brain. So I'm inviting you to wiggle or shake or just move a little bit to get back into your body. And when you're ready, to find a supportive seated, standing, or lying down position. Yeah. So this is going to be a brief guided visualization. If you're not into guided visualizations, you don't have to do it. Choosing is more important than doing. So if you are choosing to do it, I invite you to close your eyes or let them drift to a neutral spot in the room. Long breath in, longer breath out. And I invite you to imagine that you are at the end of a long and ideal career in your chosen helping profession. Some of you may be closer to an end of a career than others, so this will be easier for you. So imagining that your career has been ideal. All of your past clients or patients have come to celebrate you at a giant party. Yes, this probably couldn't happen in real life. We're just pretending. All of your clients, patients. So some of them start to get up and make speeches about the work that you've done. Yes, that's probably embarrassing for some of you, but hey, you've had an amazing career. You've changed at least some people's worlds, if not the whole world. So you can take it. Receive the compliments. What are these clients or patients, service users saying about you? What do they remember about you and your work? Take some time to hear what they're saying about you and your ideal career. Maybe one or two more long breaths here. And when you're ready, maybe slowly blink your eyes a few times. Gentle wiggle, easy stretch. Finding your way back to our shared Zoom connection. I would invite you to take a few seconds now to write down just some of the words or impressions that you got from that. The things, those imaginary, or in some of your cases, maybe real, right? Clients or patients were saying about you. Those things that those praises they were singing, those things that you did or imagined that you did that were good, that worked. And these are just to keep for yourself, but if you are so inclined, I would love it if at least a few people would share at least one or two words in the chat as well about what the ideal imaginary client or patient would be saying about you and your ideal career in the helping professions. And so from Tori, we have, they made me feel seen. From Vivienne, that I listened. From Sasha, ally, non-judgmental, kind, beautiful, beautiful. Acceptance, I felt like I mattered. Yeah. Fighter, yes. Saw them as a whole person before as clients, approachable, accessible, quality of presence, yes. So there might be more flowing in. I just want to take a moment to breathe all of that goodness, like, wow. And here's the thing, I bet some of your clients really are saying those things about you. Probably can't hear them, but, or maybe if you're lucky, they sent you a letter saying that. I had a couple of those letters in my life, and I just cry and cry when I think about them. So why do this exercise? Well, because it's a reminder of your values. And I think that our values are a really important compass for when we think about ethics, particularly when we live in this colonial form of helping profession system where ethics are dictated to us. Not only the end value of ethics, like beneficence, non-maleficence, fidelity, the other two, but like the exact way that those ethics are meant to be carried out. Like in this situation, do this specifically within this certain amount of time in some cases, right? And maybe those actions, those prescribed ethical values and those ethical pathways don't align with our own understanding of what ethics is in a live sense, particularly when we're talking about a paradigm of social work or helping work, where we want to change the colonial system that we live in because we know it not to be a just one. So when we're trying to figure out, well, what does that mean if the dominant paradigm of ethics isn't working for me and I don't know what to do, I invite you to start with your values. So we could look at those words, acceptance, quality of listening, they made me feel seen and heard, fighter, all those other things. We could do some more work with them, right? Like what do they really mean about you and what you value, what you would value about yourself as an ideal helping professional. I think that's really key when we start to become agentic, when we start to really think about what is it we're here to do? What is the work we came here to do as helping professionals? So let's look at some contemporary conflicts. I've just made these up. So let's say you're a student in an Intro to Mental Health for Social Service Professionals class, and the professor is describing how trauma can impact individual sense of safety, which can cause, for example, quote, pathological mistrust of government and police, and a student angrily observes that the mistrust of state authorities, the mistrust of police is not pathological, but a valid reality for oppressed minorities. And a huge debate breaks out in the class. I didn't mean to go to the next slide. Huge debate breaks out in the class. Some of the students walk out in protest. I'm just going to invite you to take a breath, take that little vignette in, and I would love it if folks could type into the chat, does that sound like something that either you've already experienced or you could imagine happening in your field of practice or work? You can just type a yes or no. I'm here, I'm seeing, okay. Yes, 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 yes. Certainly can imagine it happening. Yes, 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 yes. And I will say I used to TA anti-oppressive social work here at McGill. So I know it happened, it could happen. Then possibly could happen now. I've been gone for a minute. Okay, so next vignette. Let's say you are working in a community health agency. A youth client tells you that their parent, an undocumented, racialized migrant, recently, quote, grabbed them angrily during a parent-child conflict. And the client tells you this has never happened before, and it wasn't physically dangerous, they weren't harmed. So you tell your supervisor, and your supervisor says, well, you have to report the incident to Child Protection, DYP in the Quebec context, right? And so you tell your supervisor, well, you've got some qualms about this. The parent's undocumented, they're racialized. This could really mess things up in a lot of big ways. And the supervisor says, you need to develop a thicker skin to be in this line of work, and you have to call child protection immediately, or it will be their duty to report you. Okay, let's take another breath. Inviting you to type into the chat, this time, any initial sensations or emotions, not yet cognitions, okay? Sensations or emotions that scenario brings up for you. And obviously, please don't disclose anything to this group that you wouldn't want to disclose in public. Rage, torn, unfair, really cold hands, confusion, tension, madness unleashed, chest tightening. Yeah, okay. So big stuff, big stuff. So this happened to me, okay? 3-ish years ago. And I know that I wasn't alone in having that type of experience because I cried about it to a lot of friends in the field. Okay, last scenario. Let's imagine you're a professor. Let's imagine you're a professor. Some of you are like, I don't have to imagine that. Teaching in a social work program. Because you are the only openly queer faculty member, many LGBTQ students in the program come to you for mentorship. One day, students tell you that a different professor has been repeatedly misgendering trans students in the program. And they say, you have to do something about this. And the other professor needs to be disciplined. They say that they're planning on calling out the professor on social media, and they need you to get involved. But you start to suggest alternative routes to conflict resolution, and the students actually get upset with you. They tell you you're a traitor, you're being complicit, and that you need to get on board if you really want to be an ally. Okay, long breath there. Okay. So now, if you would like, I invite you to type into the chat some thoughts you have about this last scenario. I'm seeing the emotion still flowing in from the last one. That's a big emotion evoker, okay? So yeah, they don't have to be fully formed thoughts. Don't take pressure, do what's right is the thought, okay? Compassion for the student's frustration, holding space for all of it. I love that. Yeah, holding space for all of it. We're gonna come back to that. Yeah. Alternative paths, seeing a bigger picture. Anything else? Maybe any questions that you have? I wouldn't take it on social media right away. Talk with them in person or go to their boss, or go to social media as a last resort. You don't want to dox anyone. Okay, so some specific instructions. I see we're still leaving the social media thing open. Is this an opportunity for those students to practice conflict resolution? Would they resolve conflict on social media with their clients? They would say probably not. Finding support and courage to talk to the colleague who is misgendering. So this is the justice focus. We need different ways to address. Yeah, we need different ways. This is tricky as a trans student. Misgendering feels so violent. Yeah, I remember being misgendered as a trans student. I was misgendered this morning when I got my pay stub from a workplace. How to connect, learning to harmonize. Important to recognize how salient social media is. Okay, there's so much happening in this chat. And I love that. It means you have a lot of thoughts. And I think that means these scenarios are evocative. And I think that means maybe these scenarios sound realistic. I have made these things up, but obviously, as I said, they're pretty true to my life in social services. And I'm using them because I think they're really great examples. Well, I made them really great. I don't know. I hope they're really great examples of the kinds of situations that bring up interesting questions for us around ethics and justice and the work we're here to do. So here's some context, and this will be familiar to probably all of you, but let's go over some context. Why are these big questions and these big kinds of situations coming up now? Well, part of it is like social media has entered the picture. Part of it is that social justice has been building steam in the helping professions, particularly social work, as a movement for at least a couple, but probably a few decades in using that terminology. And then before that, using different terminology, social justice. But what's the really even bigger context to that? Well, it's the colonial one, I would argue. Even though anti-oppressive theory and praxis are a core competency of the social work profession, um, these questions still come up. So our disciplinary theory acknowledges that social work, healthcare, and psychiatry and psychology are neither inherently good nor neutral. While helping professionals provide essential services to communities, we also play an instrumental role in creating, maintaining, and enforcing social norms and power dynamics. And helping professions have been directly responsible for carrying out social atrocities, including but not limited to the 60s scoop, right? I know probably all of you have heard of this. The 60s scoop was just this moment when a generation of Indigenous children was, I would say, violently removed from their families and then put into care homes that were often abusive. We could talk also about many different levels and layers to the intergenerational cultural genocide of Indigenous peoples that social work and similar professions have participated in. The eugenics and enforced sterilization of disabled people, medical experimentation and exploitation of Black and other racialized peoples. One of the most infamous examples of this is, of course, the Tuskegee syphilis study, which was a study in which like a very wide population of Black men were told they were being treated for syphilis, and they were not. In this long-term cohort study, they were instead being studied to look at the impacts of the disease. And the pathologization of LGBTQ2S individuals and the practice of conversion therapies, which is a practice that is technically banned for some in Canada today, but arguably continues, particularly when it comes to gender creative or gender nonconforming children and trans youth. So again, long breath in, long breath out. These are the histories that continue into the present of our helping professional dynamics and our ethics. They're also really live stories for many of us. Like I don't want to pretend like we're floating above it all, because we are not. Many of us or our families have lived through the stories that are indicated on this slide. And for those of us who haven't, many of us are then living in the perspective or in the shoes of the perpetrator class. And we will talk about what that means and what that feels like in just a second. So that is the historical context of conflict as it comes up in our field. And I'm also seeing something pop up in the chat. Let's see. Okay. Yes, more opportunities to consider these situations. Well, I invite you to talk about them more in classes and study groups. More on that in a second. What is the micro context? And this is where I really found there to be a huge gift in bringing together micro practice and macro or mezzo practice. Really delighted to bring in systems theory and psychotherapy thinking with anti-oppression and systemic, like larger systemic thinking. So we are often taught in models of conflict analysis to look at the action of party A and then the impact on party B, right? What was the intent? What was the action? What was the effect? And we see this, in many different kinds of nonviolent communication models or different ways of looking at conflict. What we don't often see in conflict analysis is the added layer of trauma. So what happens when trauma is triggered or activated by a conflict? And then what about the impact of systemic power, privilege, and oppression on those conflicts as well? How is systemic power, privilege, and oppression mediated by trauma into the body of those who are having an internal or interpersonal conflict? And I would argue that it's almost impossible to have a serious conflict about something that is, about a fundamental value that doesn't trigger trauma. Because conflict is this burst of intensity, it is this trigger of stress to the nervous system that throws us into the fight or flight dynamic that feels like a life-threatening situation to the body. It often is life-threatening in particular ways, and that will evoke trauma, as we know as helping professionals. And then really important to bring in, so what about the bigger picture of politics, sociopolitics, collective trauma? So when we're thinking about conflict in our classrooms or with our supervisors or with our clients, I'm really inviting us to think about, okay, so if I'm the one who triggered the conflict, what was my intent? what was my action, and what was the effect, factoring in individual trauma, factoring in collective trauma, and systemic power, privilege, and oppression. And we think about the example of a social work class and a professor, let's just say, like, with really good intention, saying, mistrust of the government and police is paranoia. Like, let's just say that's a really well-intentioned thing to say, if incorrect or really problematic in some views. Well, including mine, but then the class explodes. Why does the class explode? Well, probably because the trauma narrative of several people in that class is being triggered. And it might be an individual trauma narrative, like I have experienced being brutalized by police, or a friend of mine has been brutalized by police or government. And then also there's this much bigger picture, like there's several centuries of different communities being brutalized by police in this country, in Canada. Which then we have this huge societal conflict and huge individual trauma erupting in our tiny classroom, in our frail human bodies. How are we going to deal with that? What are we going to navigate that with? And how can we, as educators and practitioners, prepare ourselves? How can we prepare our own bodies to stand and withstand the stress, the triggering, our own stuff in all of that? So I think Sarah Khan is with us today, and it was Sarah Khan who introduced me to this reading from sociologist Kai Erikson. So I'm kind of delighted to bring this full circle. So Kai Erikson defines collective trauma as a blow to the basic tissues of social life that damages the bonds attaching people together and impairs the prevailing sense of communality. The collective trauma works its way slowly and even insidiously into the awareness of those who suffer from it. I continue to exist, though damaged, maybe even permanently changed. You continue to exist, though distant and hard to relate to, but we no longer exist as a connected pair or as linked cells in a larger communal body. Isn't that beautiful? That quote has stayed with me for, like, I don't know how many years it's been now, like 7 or 8 years since I was in Sarah's class. And it has come up again in the context of the conflict work I do. I think a prejudice or a bias of classic mediation or conflict resolution work is to think about workplace conflict specifically as being between individuals. I would argue that most of the time in the helping professions, especially today, our conflicts are at least partially about collective trauma. Because we are invoking, as I said, these huge histories, often that we're a part of directly as recipients, but also, if we're not impacted directly as recipients of collective trauma, as part of the perpetrator class. And that's a huge thing that we have to deal with. So this is another model that I've made just to kind of repackaging all of the information I just said. Collective trauma flowing into individual trauma, meeting explosive conflict on one side, and on the other, collective supremacy. So this belief that we're trained into, if we're part of a perpetrator class or an oppressor class, the colonial way was the right way. There were some good things that came from colonization. We used to hear this all the time without any pushback from media or major authority. These big stories that we're good and we have to be good. We're always good. That's collective supremacy. And it comes with collective fragility because it means we can't hear how what we've done might have been really, really harmful. That feeds into individual trauma and individual needs as well. And these things come together in the middle and they blow up. Collective trauma floods interpersonal conflict with stories and needs that are beyond the capacity of the individual moment to meet. So when we're with those students, say, who are angry and want to call out a professor, we have to remember it's not just the individual act of misgendering that might be, igniting those students' righteous fury, their rage, their grief, and their grievance, as social worker Linda Tai would say, grief and grievance. There is also a piece of it that is the much bigger story. And no, it is not the direct responsibility always to take to take accountability for the huge backstory that people bring in. But as schools of social work, as communities of helping professionals, I would argue that we do have some obligation to be aware of how these huge stories get pushed upon, impinged upon, triggered. when I was going through my own internships in the School of Social Work. I was deep in debt, like, really struggling in a lot of ways, also transitioning simultaneously. And there were some big things that happened to me that were triggering to me. And because I think the field of social work, not just your individual school, because I've talked to many big schools of social work, all across the country and in the United States as well, because the schools of social work were not really made to think about what are marginalized students going through, how are their stories getting activated, because those schools weren't built thinking really about collective trauma at all. It wasn't really like a thing when social work was being born as a profession. I would argue that we're not really well equipped to handle these conflicts when they come up, because the needs that emerge are huge and they speak to something bigger than what is happening in the individual moment, even when something that's happening in the specific moment is also sometimes pretty serious. I'm going to stop and take a glance at the chat. Yes, Sandra Bloom. Ooh, I can't wait to check that out. Okay, analysis. So I'd like to now kind of move from collective trauma to moral injury, and this thing I keep calling the perpetrator class. So those of you who have taken anti-oppression, intro to anti-oppression practice, or whatever analogous class or seminar, you'll be familiar with the term oppressor class, right? The group that is dominant. And there's more than one oppressor class. We can be part of an oppressor class and part of an oppressed class at the same time. This is a bit of a generalization. I also like the term perpetrator class because I think it captures more accurately the dynamic that's going on, especially in those really heated conflicts, either internal or interpersonal, that come up in the heat of the moment. Members of perpetrator classes, they have to deal with the fact that inside of them, in their lineage somewhere, is a perpetrator energy, is a perpetrator story that is going to impinge upon other people's survivor stories. And that's huge. It is huge because we want to think of ourselves as good. How many of you as professors ask, your students, how many of you came here to help people, right? And then everybody raises their hand and you're like, okay, let's think about what helping people means, right? So we know in the helping professions, people want to be good. We're here to be good. And then there's this huge tension of, okay, part of us is not good. And I would argue that almost everybody is at least in some way part of some perpetrator class. So how do we deal with that? And social work, particularly as a profession, is a perpetrator profession. I don't think we can get out of that. I don't think we can escape that label because of our really specific, really well documented also participation in cultural atrocities, some of which some would argue are continuing today, right? The overrepresentation of Black and Indigenous and other racialized youth in child welfare systems across Canada and the States are still participating in that. And members of perpetrator groups tend to respond with a variety of strategies because the threat to identity can be destabilizing or even debilitating. It's huge. As I'm talking right now, probably some of you are feeling little bombs go off in your bodies, hey? Like, oh my God, am I a perpetrator class? Am I a member of a perpetrator group? Right? That's huge. Like, it's not a simple thing to get over. And the strategies include, as documented in the literature, because we have to be scientific. We don't, but this is a presentation to a university, so I thought I would bring in the literature. Include denying, I didn't do that, we didn't do that. Nope, it wasn't so bad. There were good things about colonization, or disidentifying. I'm not really like that. I'm not a social worker like that. I'm an anti-oppressive social worker. I'm not one of them. Disidentifying with the perpetrator group. What's that all about? Well, I think part of it is about moral injury. We don't always want to look at moral injury, which is the wounding of the psyche and spirit that happens when we are forced or tricked into witnessing or participating in an act or multiple acts that are in violation of our personal and collective values. A specific kind of trauma that happens when our understanding of goodness in ourselves and the world around us is damaged. And if I think about every time I had to make a call to the police or to Child Protective Services as a youth and family counselor that didn't go well, and I would say they didn't go well most of the time, and I would also say most of the time that call didn't help, right? Like there would be an investigation and then nothing would happen, and then the child would still be in danger, but their parent would know that they had told. Or that I would call the police and then the client would say, that was horribly traumatic for me. I can never trust you or any worker again. I mean, also maybe they got over it, but still, that feeling, I did something and I knew at the time that it probably wasn't going to be that helpful. Still had to do it. That's moral injury. So how do we turn that all around? I mean, I don't know. I'm only 30, you guys, but effective collective trauma healing contains the elements of truth and reconciliation, these tired words in Canada, truth and reconciliation, but also accountability. Accountability, ability to make an account, to tell the story, to fill in missing information, to account for the lost, and owning the harm. So this too comes from literature. It actually comes from literature around the Holocaust and other forms of genocide around the world. Really like to bring it in here. What would it mean for us as helping professionals to build accountability, our ability to tell the story well? What happened? Who was lost? What was lost? What was the loss? What is the grief and what is the grievance? And how are we answering for it? When we have trauma and small groups or tightly knit groups, we tend to get a whole bunch of conflict dynamics that are around kind of binary thinking or polarization. If you're not with us, you're against us. We get toxic triangulation, like you have to be in, and I'm gonna pull you in, and if you're not, then I'm gonna get someone else to pull you in, right? So this pulling other people in thing. We get this in-group, out-group thing, like, well, when we're good, it's because we're good people, and when we're bad, it's because we're having a bad day, but when they're bad, it's because they're evil. We're always watching each other, and there's a culture of escalation, like every conflict is going to kill us. Every conflict brings us right back to that time our lives were in danger, or many lives were endangered by many years of danger. And I think this is important to look at because when we're having such big conflicts all the time, these are the things that can tank an organization. They can poison the community of a school of social work. They can ruin relationships between practitioners and managers or practitioners and supervisors. So what do we do with all this? Well, I like to turn to Audre Lorde in Times of Trouble, who was a Black feminist, lesbian poet and theorist. Her famous phrase, among many, is "the master's tools will never dismantle the master's house." And so here's my kind of challenge to my kind of fellow activists and those who live in the social justice world with me, is I don't believe that we can force change in communities of change work, in communities of helping professionals, by trying to demand and use force alone. Force is sometimes really important. I don't ever want to rule out the tactic of pressure because heat is good sometimes. But I'm really remembering a debate I had with someone in the School of Social Work recently, not recently, like a while ago, but recently it's come up about when we always use aggression to address conflicts that are outside of our community or that are kind of out-group to us, we're also going to turn to aggression with conflicts that are in-group to us. And so I think it's really important to cultivate a really big range. The master's tools, the colonial tools, are these tools of domination. And I don't think that we're going to win the battle to make our helping professions more socially just by trying to dominate, which doesn't mean we can't stand up for ourselves, which doesn't mean we shouldn't ever do pressure tactics. I really want to turn to transformative justice here. It's my last big concept that I'm going to bring in for today, and then we're going to get to enlightenment. Transformative justice is a paradigm of ethics, conflict, and change. And here I'm calling it a new paradigm on the slide, but it's also based in ancient indigenous practices of governance that really old as well. So there's nothing ever that's really new. Hey, it's rediscovering things that are old and in many cases were erased by colonization. So transformative justice is a revolutionary paradigm of social change making that is rooted in transforming the social conditions that lead to harm in a generative and non-punitive way. And I really like this as a lens for looking at conflict. Like when we're looking at conflict, especially the social justice inspired conflict, and I have to say, like I'm really thinking right now about the recent tragedies that happened in Atlanta, the shooting of 6 Asian women and 2 other people as well, East Asian women who worked in massage parlors, very potentially erotic industry workers as well. A lot of the dialogue has immediately become like, will the shooter get punished? Will he be imprisoned? I actually don't care about that. I don't care at all. I want a society where it's not so easy to walk into a massage parlor and kill other people, where that doesn't happen because people don't think about it. And that's a really extreme example. But when we're thinking about some of the conflicts I named, drew out for you here at the beginning of the presentation in schools of social work between supervisors and frontliners, really inviting us to think about what happens when we lose the lens of punishment, when we lose the lens of justice, like what's going to happen to the bad person, and think more about how are we going to make a better world? Like, what is this teaching us? How is this conflict shining a light on things that need to happen? Like, so the professor who's misgendering trans students, well, maybe that shines a light on there needs to be sensitivity training. There's been hundreds of sensitivity training, as you all say to me. Okay, maybe that shines a light on there needs to be a policy, like a clear procedure for what happens when a professor misgenders a student, because that's why people go to social media, hey? That's why we get callouts and cancellations and all these big kinds of spectacles, because there usually isn't another process that people trust will work. I would have to give homage here to the work of Mariam Kaba, Adrienne Marie Brown, Leah Lakshmi, Piapsna Samarasenha, Mia Mingus, and many, many other queer feminist thinkers of color. This workbook that I'm blurrily displaying to you on the slide is something really important to me in my own work, and I imagine it could be really important to some of you. It's a workbook for facilitating community accountability processes for really serious harms. So I really encourage folks to look at the work of Miriam Kaba. She also has a new book out, We Do This Till We Free Us. Adrienne Marie Brown has a book out as well, Emergent Strategy. Really encourage folks to check out the work of these amazing Black queer feminist thinkers, which lay out a map for thinking about transformative justice that steps away from punishment and looks more toward change. I am dropping in here my own loving justice model. Loving justice is like this attempt to bridge transformative justice, which is like a broader kind of lens on things, with like my own inclination toward somatic theory and spiritualism. Like, what is the really practical stuff that we need to do in order to get to a place where we can do transformative justice? And so I'll just tell you, I made this lens because I was seeing lots and lots of conflict around me where people were getting called out. Like, people were being dragged in public. Everyone was scared of losing their jobs, losing their reputations, and the harms that were being named around me were really big, like sexual assault, sexual harm, extended abuse, all these kinds of things. And I wanted to know, like, why am I so confused? Like, why can't I get fully on board with punishing perpetrators? And why can't I get on board with some of these like redemption stories either? Like, people are saying, making these big apologies, but like nothing's happening. So what do I need to do? So I made myself a map. This is initially just for me, of my own values. Courage, honesty, humility, and kindness. I'm not always living up to these values, by the way. Like, it seems pretty difficult to do all the time, but it's something I aspire to. And particularly whenever I look at first my own actions in a situation of conflict or harm, I try to measure my actions by these questions. Is it honest? Is it humble? Is it kind? Is it brave? And I think, this is not something that we want to apply like a sledgehammer. It's something we want to do thoughtfully and to ourselves first. But particularly when we take the role of the third party, okay? So when that triangulation thing happens, when the students go to the professor and they say, you need to join us in calling out one of your colleagues, my suggestion is that professor go to values, maybe these ones, if that's helpful, or maybe, their own. What are the different steps I could take? And are those steps in alignment with my values? And are those values oriented toward transformative change rather than punishment? Because I think that most of us, if we really stop to think about it, don't value punishment as much as we think we do. All right. This is like a bit of a Jungian take on the loving justice conflict lens. Just this idea that whenever we are embroiled in a conflict with other people, there's also a conflict that gets ignited within ourselves. So when our colleague says something that's really, really racist in the team meeting, we're like, you're a racist, how dare you? Particularly when we're not the person being impacted by the racist statement, but we're still really angry. What's that about? Well, I would argue it's about our self-concept. Particularly if we share being a member of the perpetrator class with the person who said the racist thing or did the racist thing. We start to see ourselves in that person, and we really don't like that, so we attack them. And like, hey, that's a very, very old thing. And I don't think we can change it right away necessarily, but I'm inviting us to take stock of it, to take reflection on it. Like, when I get really heated as a quote ally and start attacking my colleagues, is that helping the conflict? Is that moving toward transformative justice? Or is it moving toward punishment? And has punishment been shown to work? Will punishment make me feel better about myself in the long run? Just a few thoughts. I'm going to skip this one because I want to get to question period as well. So, okay, that was a lot of blah blah blah, lots of theory. How can we actually transform our professions with the lens of transformative justice? Here are some suggestions I have, because everyone loves like practical tools to take away at the end. So I made some practical ideas to take away at the end, but I just want to say, I really think the questions are more interesting than the answers a lot of the time, because when we try answers like rigidly, or when we try to apply tools rigidly, they end up not working the way we think they will. So I invite you to take my questions and make them your own, editing or changing them as you will. What's happening in the chat? Oh, there's a question. Okay, Charlotte or Shalette, I will get to that question in the question answer period. But to kick us off, for students of the helping professions, I really encourage the forming of affinity groups, like especially if you're a member of a marginalized class, to get together and not be alone. If you can, if there are other people. I was the only like trans woman in my cohort for a really long time, so like I know it also can be difficult, but to form affinity groups so you can talk about what's happening, so you don't have to be alone. To engage in active discussion about professional ethics and ethical conflicts inside and outside the classroom, because if you're really lucky, you're gonna have a great ethics teacher like Kate, who will push you to look beyond like the static form of professional ethics that we have today, but maybe you won't, right? And also, you're going to need lots of people to talk about ethical conflicts if you're going to get engaged with your work as practicum students or early practitioners, or practitioners later on as well, because it's really easy to toe the line and say, okay, well, I'm just going to follow the rules and keep my head down, keep my job, the paycheck, want to buy an apartment, something like that someday. So I'm just going to toe the line and have my private feelings by myself. And that moral injury grows and grows. We can respond to moral injury by getting outraged. We can respond by getting numb. It's happening inside of us. And I just encourage you to keep talking about it, because I think that will help us to stay active around it. To develop the collective skills for engaging with conflict generatively. So I do, really long, like, weekend-long trainings on engaging with conflict generatively. Doesn't mean I always engage with conflict generatively myself, but I try to get curious about the other. Like, why are they doing that? What's happening inside them that I resonate with, maybe in a way I don't like? How can I transform the conditions around us so that we're moving toward a better dynamic, or a better field of understanding? For practitioners who are already in the field, really encouraging you to form committees in the workplace that actively engage with the notion of professional ethics from a transformative justice lens. So how can we change the conditions of our workplaces so that marginalized workers and clients are not being harmed, so that they are empowered? And I would really, urge you to agitate, or if you're in charge of the budget, to invest in collective trauma healing education and engaging with conflict in a transformative way. And there are lots and lots of practices that are already out there. Some of you may know them, right? Peacemaking circles, which is an ancient indigenous practice. It's also meant to be shared, which I really appreciate. It can be really powerful for doing this kind of conflict transformation work. Deep democracy is another one. Systems theory is just a blanket term for a lot of different things you could do, but there's already practices out there. It's about investing in them with a lens of social justice woven in. And then for educators and managers, to get actively involved in discussions about how helping professions can change to meet the needs of changing times. We are no longer in a time, I think, where we can say, la, 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 the social justice conversation is over there. I don't care for it. It's going to come for you, whether or not you care for it. So it's time to get engaged, acknowledge the context of collective trauma, develop accountability, develop leadership skills, especially for holding space in trauma-based social conflict environments so that we can welcome challenges and conflicts when they come in. Because this is where all of us really start to fall down. It doesn't matter if we're like super skilled therapists, like 30 years in. I've seen that, the top therapists in their fields get really unskilled by conflict because conflict is terrifying. I don't know about you, but I always feel like I'm going to die when I'm in a conflict. Like still, and I'm in conflicts every day now because of work. So that says something about me. But how do we actually train our bodies to be welcoming to conflict, to see it as an opportunity for change? We'll talk about that in the discussion period. I'm just going to leave you with this quote. I really wish I know who said it, but I don't. So hopefully it's in the public domain. And if you know who said it, please let me know. Conflict is an invitation to transform the system. That was true when I was learning family therapy. And it is true when I am talking to managers in social service agencies. It's true of frontliners. It's true of students who are complaining about what's going on and what's being taught in classes. It's an invitation to change. So just inviting us to sit with all of that, maybe take one more long breath in, long breath out, and we can jump into question, answer, discussion time period.
Thank you.
Yes, thank you so much, Kai.
Thank you so much for having me. It's been so fun. We're going to have more fun. What shall we talk about?
So we can do two things. I don't know, but somehow I think you said so much what we needed to hear today. I don't even know how it's possible. But yeah, I'm just there's so many wonderful things that you mentioned, that you spoke about, that resonated with myself as faculty, and I'm sure as students and as field supervisors, the profession. So I'm sure there'll be a lot of questions. There already are some in the chat that I've kind of flagged. So if you want me to ask your question, then please type it in the chat. Or if you would like to ask your question yourself, then you can use the raise hand feature. And I will, with Amanda, unmute you. We can go with the first question that I saw, which was from Charlotte, in terms of, could the heat coming from what's called the cancel culture be coming for more awareness in society about oppressions perpetuated? And maybe just hearing your thoughts on, the cancel culture in general.
Yeah, big debate around this cancel culture thing, hey? And I remember when I was having debates about this before it was like a mainstream issue, because queers do, well, first of all, because I'm cool and I do things before the mainstream, but also because queers do everything before the mainstream. So we were having the same debate about call-out culture many years before the cancel culture debate erupted this summer around many people, like J.K. Rowling, I believe. Gosh, how disappointing that all turned out to be. But yes, so I really do think, yes, that the cancel culture or the call-out culture debate is related to what we're talking about today. I think that the heat, as you're saying, yes, is from, well, I don't know if it's about increased awareness only. I think that's a part of it. I think that's about collective trauma rising to the surface. So that collective trauma has been there for a long time, but now we have yes, maybe greater awareness. We also have different tools for talking about it and for spreading our conversations about it. And that's kind of a good thing, I think. And also there's I think some generational shifts happening where, we could do lots and lots of discussion about this, but I suspect that the primary affect, right, the primary embodied response to collective traumas as they were happening was not to talk about them that much. That was certainly true of the Chinese Exclusion Act stuff that was happening, right? For my family, years and years and years back, not that many though, And now I, as a young person, like, I'm not going to talk about that, right? But even my parents would tell me, don't talk about racism, even though like they would be like, people are really racist, but they would say, don't talk about that outside the home. And I talk about that outside the home every day now, partially for my living. I think so. I think there's been these shifts. So maybe the primary affect with which we respond generationally to the impacts of collective trauma have just shifted. And maybe that's good, right? Like maybe there does need to be discourse. Conflict is an invitation to transform, but also conflict is very scary and it can mess up people's lives. So I think the drawback to the call out culture or cancel culture tactic is that it's like a huge sledgehammer, like a bomb, right? We don't control it. And when we feed into that culture, it grows and grows and grows. And we start to develop those traits, right? Like that sort of inside outside thinking, that surveillance of each other that can block us from going into generative change. Also can cause us to really hurt one another, which I don't think we really want when we are in our best selves. Yeah. Is there another question?
They're coming in really fast. Just a sec. Okay, so I'd like to hear more about your perspective on clinician-manager relationships and how they impact our work in public sector agencies in the health and social service.
I mean, I love that question. I think it's a really big question, and we could talk for a long time about it. I will say the clinician-manager relationship is, I think of it as sacred. Like I have a manager currently in a social service agency, and I'm so grateful that I have them because our relationship has empowered me to do a lot of things I could not do otherwise. And that said, we've had really, really tough times because we both had different ideas at different times about what doing justice in our work meant. And that has been really hard for me. And there's no way to escape the fact that there's like a really big power differential in that relationship. And I will say, since becoming a conflict coach, and I have about 20 people on a coaching caseload at any time, half of my clients are managers of social service agencies, and all of them are telling me I'm terrified of the front line. terrified of the front line and what they say to me. And they're always telling me I'm problematic. And I didn't get into this work to stop people from doing the good they wanted to do. And then there's lots of tears, right? And I say that with the most love and affection possible because I think that's a really serious journey to be going through. And a phrase that's come up in the conflict coaching conversations I have with my clients around this are, yeah, so there's something about management and particularly middle management, but maybe upper management too, where there's maximum responsibility and minimal power. And that's really, really tough, right? Because the front line is saying, you have all this responsibility, and it's true, you have lots of responsibility. How much power do you actually have to change the system in which we work? It's pretty small. It's pretty small. And that's where, again, the moral injury stuff comes in. Because when we dig deep enough with lots of management folks that are coming to me anyway, I'm hearing, yes, well, and actually I think I'm bad because I don't know how to do this. So that relationship is fraught because it is a relationship inside a pressure cooker, pressure from the bottom, pressure from the top. And I don't have the answers to this, except, I do a lot of thinking about how can we continue to humanize each other? How can we continuously do the work of humanizing each other? And then turning, so I think that when we're able to bring that dignity and respect, that soft quality into the manager-clinician relationship, and that really, I think that the responsibility for setting that tone is with the manager, then we're able to kind of turn that softer gaze to the work outside as well, which then maybe creates more flexibility. That's a bit of a woo-woo answer, I'm afraid, but hopefully somewhat helpful.
And just in addition to the question in terms of, managers who might be hired more for administrative work and don't necessarily have those soft skills or haven't been taught those soft skills, other clinical skills to be able to engage in that kind of process and that relationship.
Absolutely. Absolutely.
Okay, another question. What do you see as the role of shame in maintaining the perpetrator class?
Oh, that's such a big question. I don't know. What does the question ask? Do they want to talk about it? I would love to hear.
Do you want to, can I unmute you? Oh, I do that.
Hi. Sarah. Hi, Sarah.
No, I kept, first of all, thank you. This is amazing, wonderful, exciting, alive, and also really what I love is it seems actionable in some ways, right? So, you know, despite its bigness, they're like things like a normal person may be able to do. So it's a wonderful gift. Thank you so much. Yeah, I'm just wondering, because a lot of what you're talking about, you know, I'm thinking, for example, just what you said about the manager coming to you and saying, I don't really know what to do, or I'm not good enough. You know, I think I'm just wondering the degree to which some kind of shame is present there. Shame in being part of a perpetrator class, that a perpetration that has been unacknowledged, how shame may operate to keep things under wrap, to keep the acknowledgement, you know, sealed over because of the potential for being shamed. And I think that's what cancel culture really does. It shames people. And I think what you're talking about is something else. So anyway, I'm just wondering what you think about that issue.
Oh, I love this, and I would also love to have an extended conversation with you about this, Sarah, because I know you're of course a trauma expert and probably have lots of things to say. I think that the shame is a mechanism, like it's a defensive mechanism that is meant to keep us safe, right? Like it's meant to keep us small. And then shaming is this tactic that is meant to make us smaller, meant to shrink us. And I think really important as well to bring in the concept of humiliation, which is a bit different from shame, because humiliation involves this fall from grace, right? This public fall from grace where we're sort of ruined in the eyes of the other. And shame is very internal, but humiliation is very relational. So I would say, you know, cancel culture's weapon is humiliation. And then shame on the part of the perpetrator class is this like sort of hook into humiliation. And like that staying small thing, I think what it does, or its impact can be to prevent us from acting. Like, oh my God, shame, so I don't do anything. Really, really scared of what's going to happen if I try to do something and then I do it wrong. And I think, you know, we could really look, you know, at the manager situation with that. We could also look at like an educator situation. Like, how many times have we seen or been the professor who is getting called out? I've been called out when I've been teaching classes before, and it sucks, you know. And the immediate response to me is to be like, okay. You're right, and like to go away, which doesn't satisfy, right, the demand that is being made, which is the demand for engaged transformation, and it usually for prolonged conversation as well. Yeah. Oh, lots of questions. So, Alicia?
Yeah, I'll go with Sarah's question. Can you talk about how to deal with conflict in organizations when one party is refusing to acknowledge or address the conflict and the other party is escalating in response, especially when the party stonewalling holds more power?
Hey, Sarah, I love that you're here. I mean, how to deal with conflict in organizations when the party in power is stonewalling and refusing to acknowledge that the conflict exists and the other is escalating. Yeah. So that's like one of these like log jams in a conflict, hey? And I would say sometimes you actually have to wait until the escalation has hit a point where the party in power has to respond. And that is like a time-honored revolutionary tactic that I just want to give homage to. Like, we don't have to not do that. Like, that sometimes is the measure of last resort, right? But ideally, especially if it's an organization that is precious to us and where the parties are or were once precious to each other, and you know, I would hope that those of us in the School of Social Work or you know whatever organizations we're part of, I hope that we can be precious to each other. We might want to do something different. So what that different thing might look like is bringing in an external. Or at least having an actor who can be like come from a place of relative impartiality, if not neutrality, right? We can't be really neutral, but we can be impartial sometimes. And what I would really advise is then working with the party in power. Conflict is so tied to leadership. And when we have leadership power, whether or not we like it, it's a bit on us to set the tone for how the conflict is going to get resolved or not resolved. So the party in power, and this is systems thinking, right? Like if we were doing family therapy, we wouldn't say to the child, well, it's your job to de-escalate. It's the parent's job to de-escalate. So it's the principal or the executive director's job to de-escalate. So we would have to work with the party in power first. And this is where that individual conflict coaching can really come in handy. If I'm going to get really granular with it, like, so what's stopping you from acknowledging this? And sometimes they'll be like, oh, legal reason, legal reason, legal reason. I'm not a lawyer. So I'm like, okay, like, why don't we talk to some lawyers about that? But also underneath the, like, all my legal reasons are my fears. And usually those fears are related to shame and humiliation. So, you know, the questions become like, okay, so if conflict is an invitation to change, how can we engage in that change in a way that feels safe enough? And particularly for leaders and leadership, how can we change inside ourselves so that we are feeling brave enough? What would it take to become brave enough? Which is very challenging, super challenging. But that's what I got. Yes.
We'll go to the hands in the audience. So Ash, do you want to ask your question? And then Miles. Ash, you can go first. Oh.
Okay, I think I'm unmuted. Yeah. Thank you so much for your presentation today, Kai. I have just one quick question. I'm also trying to really promote the use of a transformative justice framework and teach about transformative justice theory and approaches in class. And I think that sometimes when I'm talking about it from a very theoretical perspective, it can be, especially for Zoom. Zoom is really hard, but I'm wondering if you have any sort of ideas about more like group activities so that folks can have sort of an experiential and embodied experience of what transformative justice could look like. That's all. Thanks.
Well, I would love to come to your class and do some group activities, truly. But also, yes, I love this. I think where transformative justice gets like lost sometimes is like, what is it like? What do you do? Because theory is very beautiful, but also, you know, very poetic. Sometimes we're like, okay, so we're all mushrooms, we're all birds flying together. What do we do with that? If you read Adrienne Marie Brown's book, you're going to get the mushrooms and birds joke. But so the practical doing, I would really recommend getting a copy of that Fumbling Towards Repair workbook, because that actually is truly a workbook with like fill in the blanks that you could actually have students fill in as a class activity or as part of an assignment or something. But another, I think, is like a really practical activity that I love. Well, there's two. One is design an accountability process for an imaginary conflict. I would not make that conflict the most traumatic conflict you can think of. I would make it something relatively mild. But just thinking about if we were going to take punishment out of the equation, like that kind of seeking justice out of the equation, what would we like? What could we come up with? There are some amazing things. People think of really cool stuff when we take punishment out of the equation, or they really struggle, and that's a great conversation too. And then my last thing that I will invite is any variant on the loving kindness meditation that comes from Tibetan Buddhism, right? So this practice of feeling loving compassion for oneself really deeply, and then feeling loving compassion for another whom we like, and then another whom we don't like. Because it is really, really hard for us in the midst of conflict when the animal and the reptilian brain are in, you know, full force. I don't know if we like triune brain theory. I know it's like very sort of passe now, but as a metaphor, it's really difficult to keep two things in mind at the same time, right? I am okay, you're okay, to use another old one, or just, I'm a human worthy of dignity and respect. And so are you, even if I don't condone anything you're saying or any of your actions, particularly when it's colleagues that I think we are meant to like and respect, if at all possible. Yes.
Yes. Hi. Thank you so much, Kai. This has been, I have no words. This has been amazing. So I think you've spoken and like touched on this already, but this idea of punishment and shame, but also of accountability. And so when you're of the perpetrator group, and I'm thinking very much so in the context of being in my BSW at McGill. I'm just wondering if you could speak on this idea of how do we hold and care for the people that have been hurt, and then acknowledging, like, does punishment, like, I guess punishment doesn't really get us to where we want to be, but also the people who are hurt are so hurt, right? And so how do we do both at the same time? Like, as validating that anger is a valid emotion. I don't know if I'm being super clear, but just like this, I find I'm often operating this dichotomy of like being in the group that I'm like, this thing happened and it's not okay. And I don't know if I want to call you out, but I would want to call you in. But I also think there should be consequences. I don't know if you could speak to that sort of dilemma.
Yes. Well, conflicts are an extra, like navigating conflict in like a transformative justice way, or just in a non-punitive way, is an exercise in non-dual thinking, right? Like, so we're always going to get this, like, I have to hold two contradictory ideas at the same time thing over and over and over again. And it will be like horrifying and exhausting, and you'll lose the thread. And then at least this is what has happened to me. I'm just laughing at myself because I was in a conflict this weekend with a friend, and I totally was like, oh, you're horrible. You're a horrible person. And I was like, oh, right. Yes. Conflict expert. Great job. So I think what you're asking me is, how do we do the thing of, we want to do loving repair and transformation, but also some people are really angry and really hurt, and that hurt must be answered for, right? And so this is like where I would invite us to get a little thoughtful and like to do that deep breathing and think, so where do we naturally tend to go? Consequences. Punishment is how we answer for harm. But that is just one of an infinite number of ways that harm can be answered for. One of an infinite number of ways that accountability can be manifested. So I would say, as an intervener, and this is a really important thing, like I think as workers and people are interested in this area, we need to master the role of intervener if we're going to be effective. And, mastery is like a moving target. Like, really, how do we sit in front of the person who has been harmed and say, I feel you and I hear you? And maybe they're not even asking for punishment, right? Like, a lot of the time they are not. And we think they are because our own stuff is like, there must be consequences. There must be justice. And then sometimes they are. And then you have to have this conversation about, what would that mean to you? What would that do for you? What are you trying to get from that? Would punishment really get you there? Because usually people are saying, I want to be safer, I want to feel respected, I want to feel lovable, I want to get my life back, all this stuff. I want there not to have been 100 years of genocide on this land. And punishment is not going to get us that. Maybe nothing will get us that. And then we get to have this like grief conversation, right? And then when we're talking to the perpetrator or perpetrator class, we do this dance of like being like connected, but also not letting off the hook. And that is like that's a skill set. I think it's like a whole seminar on.
Okay. There are two more questions, one long, one short. I'm going to ask Laura to ask your question, so I will unmute you, and then one more, and then we'll call it in.
Yeah, thank you so much, Kai. That was so insightful. Also, happy Trans Day of Visibility. Yeah, I guess like this is a bit of a long one, so like apologies in advance. It's something I struggle with, will probably struggle with forever, or as long as I'm in social work, I think. But I guess, so as a queer person, and something that like myself and other queer and trans people in U1 talk about a lot is like, we've been doing TJ in queer communities for years because calling the police is not an option. So like when you have a queer couple and one is gender nonconforming or gender variant, and they happen to be undocumented, and they come to you and say like, this person is physically abusing me. Like, as queer people and as queer community, we have options to like actually do transformative justice outside of the police and carceral state. But within social work, it's like, if someone comes to you and says that, your options, or you're mandated, like you have to go to these authoritative kind of figures. So I guess it's like, how do we implement transformative justice without commodifying it as social workers, or like watering it down, like yeah, or like at the Toronto South Detention Center, when they were like, well, we have Braille on prison cells, so now blind people can go to jail. And it's like, that's not disability justice. So like taking these grassroots movements and I guess commodifying them, like, I don't know what the answer is, but I wonder if you have any insight there.
Oh, that's a really big question too. I love it. And I invite you to dive deep into your own, because it sounds like you have some deep thinking around it already. So would love to read anything you write about it. But I mean, this debate is deep in the field, and this is sort of one of the differences between restorative and transformative justice too, which is that like restorative justice has been much more successful at institutionalizing, and transformative justice, I think, has rejected in many cases the idea of institutionalizing, because restorative justice can be practiced in prisons and the legal court system, and transformative justice says we reject those things. We want to abolish the criminal court and policing and prisons. And I don't like to get too involved in purist debates, because I don't care about them that much. I want to do whatever works around me for the moment right now. And so I guess my invitation is, I think it's okay. Like, it's sad sometimes to let go of like the purist idea of what transformative justice is in queer community, because also, to be real, I've never seen it to be beautiful and amazing in queer community. I've seen it to be messy and horrifying, and also really cool, but like messy and horrifying too. So if it does change in the social work environment, maybe that's okay, right? Like, as long as we're allowing these ideas to morph and transform. And I mean, maybe staying away from like getting totally like merged into the criminal system could be an idea, right? But letting go of purism is like maybe a helpful thing there. And I just want to address maybe one last thing, which is not quite what you asked in your question, but I'm feeling too as well. Like when we join social work, we join another perpetrator class. And that's a grief in itself. And I know that I had this, like I was screaming at, not screaming, but I was like, speaking firmly to professors when I was in my bachelor's degree about this, and sometimes because I was feeling that, like, I don't want to do that. And those of us who come in really critical already are already thinking this. I'm joining a perpetrator class. I don't want to be bad. I don't want to be bad. I don't want to be bad. But here's the truth. We're all members of some kind of perpetrator class. And as Mariam Kaba says, no one is introduced to violence as a perpetrator. So this is that last non-dual thinking thing that we have to kind of get good at, is I am good and I'm bad. And the work I'm going to do is going to be good and it's going to be bad. And I have to be able to be okay with that. Okay.
I'm like still thinking about that last day. You can't just end there, because I'm like, my mind is like, oh my gosh, I am good and I am bad, and I will do good work and I will do bad work.
It's a big one, eh, Alicia? Also, I just saw that Sherry Brotman is here, and Sherry Brotman was my MSW supervisor, so I just have to say hi, I love you, and thanks for coming.
I have a backlog of questions, and we just aren't going to be able to get to them given the time. So we're just going to have you come back again, Kai. That's just the reality of that.
I mean, I spent almost a decade at McGill School of Social Work. I can come back for like another afternoon.
So thank you so much. I don't know if you want to say something, Amanda, with regards to...
Just thank you so much again, Kai. We're so happy to have you here with us, and thank you so much for sharing all you did, and thank you everyone for coming too. So
I'm going to save the chat, and maybe I'll share the questions in the comments with you, Kai, so you can have them in case you want to just kind of go over them and just see what the reflections that your talk kind of generated amongst us within the school. And also just to say that we will be having other talks this month in April about this kind of notion of transforming social work and understanding and reconciling and asking those difficult questions that belong to us as a perpetrator profession, right? So I hope to see you all at our next talks, and have a good rest of the day. And thank you so much again, Kai. And
thank you so much for having me. What a delight to see you, and to those old friends and mentors I see. Really great to really, really great to see you all.